The wagon groaned, a sound as raw and mournful as the ache in Clara's chest. Above the sun, a malevolent, bleached eye scoured the vast sky, drawing the very moisture from the air. She burrowed deeper into the sliver of shade cast by the shattered wheel, her calico dress clinging damply to her skin. Dust, fine as confectioner's sugar, coated everything. Her hair, her parched lips, the very air she struggled to breathe, each inhale a scrape of sandpaper. An infuriating fly orbited her head. She swatted at it weakly, her arm feeling weighted with lead. How many cycles of dawn and dusk had painted the horizon in fire and ash? Time had become a suffocating, endless present. Her water skin lay beside her, a flaccid, empty husk, a cruel echo of her dwindling hope. She risked a glance from her meager refuge. The world unfurled before her, an intimidating expanse of undulating sand and sparse, thorny scrub. Heat danced above the distant dunes, twisting the landscape into a cruel mirage of shimmering water. No sign of life, no hint of the wagon train she'd lost. Just an oppressive, terrifying void that seemed to swallow sound, leaving only a ringing in her ears and the frantic drum of her own heart. Fear, cold and sharp despite the heat, pricked at her. It wasn't merely the gnawing specters of thirst and hunger, but the crushing terror of utter solitude, a speck of insignificance in this brutal, indifferent land. She, Clara Bellwether, had always been cradled by human presence, her boisterous siblings, her stern but loving parents, the lively chatter of pioneer women. Now, silence was her sole companion, magnifying every creak of the wagon, every whisper of wind through the dry brush. Her mind drifted, an involuntary, painful journey to the familiar warmth of her family. Mama, her hands quick and deft, kneading dough in their small kitchen. Papa's booming laugh recounting tales by the fire. Little Thomas, perpetually underfoot, his sticky fingers reaching for anything in grasp. Sarah, her older sister, sharing secrets and dreams in the shared darkness of their room. The vivid clarity of their faces brought a fresh wave of longing, almost physical in its intensity. "Oh, Mama," she croaked, her voice reedy and thin. "Papa." The words felt swallowed by the vastness. She closed her eyes, desperate to conjure their presence, their comfort. She remembered the day they'd set out, her heart brimming with the excitement of adventure, the promise of new beginnings. Never had she envisioned such a desolate ending. A hot, stinging tear carved a path through the dust on her cheek. A betrayal of her usual composure she couldn't halt. The thought of never seeing them again, of simply vanishing into this sun-baked expanse, was an unbearable weight. Had they even noticed her absence? Had they searched? Or had the desert already claimed her in their minds? She pressed her palms against her temples, as if to ward off the encroaching despair. She was Clara Bellwether, a sensible young woman, not prone to hysterics. But this was beyond anything she had ever faced. The very air felt thick with a sense of dread, and the sun, now dipping slightly, cast long, distorted shadows that reached out like skeletal fingers. The silence deepened, becoming less empty and more watchful, as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting. A shiver, despite the heat, traced its path down her spine. She was truly lost, adrift in the sun's merciless embrace, and the hope of rescue dwindled with each passing moment. The sun, a fiery orb sinking below the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the parched landscape. Clara, slumped against the splintered wheel of her overturned wagon, watched a particularly tall, elongated silhouette stretch towards her, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight. Her breath hitched. She had seen movement on the distant ridges throughout the day, fleeting glimpses that had sent prickles of unease down her spine. But this was different. This shadow had a shape, a presence, a distinct human form. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the desolate quiet. She squeezed her eyes shut, then forced them open, determined to face whatever came. The shadow solidified, resolving into the lean, powerful frame of an Apache warrior. He stood silently, a rifle held loosely in one hand, feathers woven into his dark hair, eyes like polished obsidian. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara. Her mind raced, conjuring tales of raids and scalpings, of the horrors that befell lone travelers. She gripped the tattered fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. He took a slow step forward, then another, his moccasins disturbing the dust with a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Clara braced herself, ready to scream, to fight, to do anything. But then he stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady, devoid of menace. He reached for a leather canteen slung over his shoulder, unstoppered it, and extended it towards her. "Water," he said, his voice a low rumble, the single word a surprise, unexpected and clear. Clara stared at the canteen, then back at his face. The fear, though still present, began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. His eyes, though unyielding, held a surprising depth, a quiet understanding that seemed to peer beyond her initial terror. There was no mockery, no malice, only a simple, profound offer of kindness. Her throat was a desert, cracked and aching. She hesitated for a moment longer, then reached out a trembling hand and took the canteen. The cool, life-giving liquid was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted, washing away the grit of dust and despair. When she had finished, she handed it back, meeting his gaze directly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "You are lost," he stated, not a question, but a simple observation. Clara could only nod in return, a fresh wave of despair threatening to overwhelm her. She thought of her family, of the vast, unforgiving miles separating them. He surveyed the overturned wagon, the scattered provisions, then returned his gaze to her. "I am Kestrel," he said. "I will guide you, back to your people." The words were a balm to her battered spirit, a promise, spoken with a quiet authority that resonated with honor. Clara felt a strange surge of relief, a fragile hope blossoming in the barren landscape of her fear. This warrior, who had initially appeared as a harbinger of doom, now offered a path home. The vast, undulating expanse of the plains stretched before them, an endless canvas of ochre and sage under a sky so immense it seemed to dwarf their very existence. Clara, astride her borrowed horse, kept her gaze fixed on Kestrel's broad back, a silent anchor in the overwhelming landscape. Dust, fine as flour, puffed up from the horse's hooves, a persistent, gritty companion. What had begun as a gentle breeze, a welcome caress after the morning stillness, now began to gather strength, tugging insistently at their clothes. Clara's simple cotton dress, sturdy as it was no match for the rising wind. It billowed around her legs, threatening to rise higher with each gust. She pressed her knees together, trying to pin the fabric, her cheeks flushing with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Her hands, already raw from gripping the reins, now fought a losing battle against the persistent lift of the hem. A particularly aggressive swirl of wind nearly ripped the fabric from her grasp, exposing more than she would ever wish. "Kestrel," she managed, her voice a thin whisper barely audible above the whistling air. Her plea was not for help with the wind itself, but with the unwanted spectacle. Her fingers clutched at the fabric, knuckles white. The Apache warrior continued to ride, his profile unwavering, seemingly oblivious. A fresh gust, more powerful than the last, whipped her skirt high, and Clara let out a small, mortified gasp. Her face burned. "Please, Kestrel," she repeated, louder this time, her voice tight with embarrassment and a touch of desperation. "The wind! My dress!" Kestrel's shoulders, which had been rigidly straight, subtly tensed. His people's customs, steeped in honor and respect, dictated a strict code of conduct between unmarried men and women, especially those not of the same clan. To witness such a sight, even accidentally, was a transgression, a challenge to his deeply ingrained principles. His brow furrowed, a silent war raging within him. He understood her unspoken plea, the plea for modesty, for dignity. Without a word, without a glance over his shoulder, Kestrel brought his horse to a halt. The sudden stop threw Clara forward slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on his back. He dismounted with practiced ease, his movements fluid and precise. Then, with a deliberate, slow motion that spoke volumes, he turned his back fully to her. His broad shoulders now formed an impenetrable barrier, shielding her from his gaze and, by extension, from the perceived shame. He stood there, unmoving, a statue carved from stone and duty, his face turned towards the vast, empty plains, his eyes scanning the distant horizon for anything but her. Clara watched him, a wave of profound relief washing over her, mingled with a quiet admiration. His silent act of respect, his understanding without explanation, touched her deeply. She quickly rearranged her dress, pulling the fabric down, smoothing it with trembling hands. The wind continued its assault, but now, with Kestrel's back a steadfast shield, its power felt diminished. She felt a profound gratitude, a nascent trust solidifying between them amidst the swirling dust and the vast, indifferent land. The air, which had been merely blustery moments before, began to churn with a malevolent energy. A low growl rumbled through the ground as the wind transformed, gathering the ochre dust into a swirling column. It started small, a distant, dancing specter, but in the blink of an eye, it gained speed and mass, hurtling towards Clara with terrifying intent. She had been adjusting the straps on the satchel, her back to the approaching menace, when the first sharp sting of grit lashed her exposed cheek. "Kestrel?" Her voice was barely a whisper, quickly swallowed by the rising shriek of the wind. He stood a few paces away, his back to her, scanning the horizon. The sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, the almost physical weight of the approaching storm, registered instantly. He spun, his eyes narrowing, and saw the towering vortex of dust bearing down on Clara. It was no ordinary wind. This was a powerful, unpredictable dust devil, capable of tearing down more than just canvas. Before he could shout a warning, it was upon her. The dust devil struck with the force of a battering ram, engulfing Clara in a blinding, choking cloud of red. She stumbled, arms flailing, a muffled cry escaping her lips as the wind clawed at her. The sound of ripping fabric was sharp, distinct, even over the gale. Her bonnet, secured moments before, was torn from her head and spun away, a discarded petal in the maelstrom. "Help me!" Clara shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. The wind whipped her skirts violently, threatening to lift her clean off her feet. She struggled to keep her footing, one hand clutching at the torn remnants of her dress, the other instinctively reaching out into the swirling void. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her usual composure. The dust stung her eyes, filled her mouth, and choked her breath. She was losing her battle against the invisible, merciless force. Kestrel's heart hammered against his ribs. The sight of her, vulnerable and struggling in the clutches of the violent wind, ignited an urgent, almost primal instinct. He had made a solemn vow, a promise born of respect and tradition, not to look upon her, to preserve her modesty. But the dust devil was showing no such respect. It was tearing at her clothes, threatening to expose her fully, to leave her utterly humiliated and potentially injured. His mind raced, a whirlwind of its own. To look away was to abandon her to the mercy of the elements, a choice his honor would never allow. To act, to reach for her, meant breaking his word, shattering the very principle he held so dear. The conflict was agonizing, a silent battle waged in the space of a single breath. He could hear her choked gasps, the frantic rustle of fabric, the increasing intensity of the wind's howl. The decision, when it came, was swift and unyielding. Clara's safety, her very well-being, outweighed any personal code, any vow, any honor he held dear. He would not stand by and watch her be torn apart. His vow could be mended, perhaps, but a broken body, a shattered spirit, that was not a burden he could bear. His eyes, dark and resolute, fixed on the swirling epicenter of the dust devil. The ground shuddered again, a low growl that vibrated through Kestrel's boots. He didn't need to see the crumbling cliff edge to know the danger. The air itself felt heavy with falling earth. Clara, still disoriented from the previous tremor, stumbled, her eyes wide with uncomprehending fear as the dust plume ahead billowed higher, closer. "Clara!" Kestrel's voice was a sharp command, cutting through the rumbling. He spun, not towards the immediate threat, but towards her, his focus entirely on her safety. He didn't look at the shifting earth, didn't spare a glance for the cascading rocks. Instead, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, a patch of sun-drenched dust. His hands reached for her without hesitation, a blur of motion. He pulled her with a decisive strength that surprised even him, yanking her clear of the widening fissure that now snaked across their path. Her small frame collided with his chest, and for a fleeting instant, he felt the delicate bone of her shoulder beneath his palm. It was during this sudden, urgent maneuver that the torn fabric of her dress, already compromised by their earlier ordeal, gave way further. A flash of pale skin, the curve of her calf, the delicate ankle. It was there and gone, a brief, unintended revelation in the chaos. Clara gasped, a sound swallowed by the roar of the collapsing earth. Her face was pressed against his buckskin tunic, the scent of smoke and dust in her hair. He held her tightly, one arm around her waist, the other shielding the back of her head as if to protect her from unseen blows. The immediate threat passed, the tremors subsiding into a series of smaller, nervous shudders from the ground beneath their feet. He could feel her trembling against him, her heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He eased his grip, allowing her to pull back slightly, though he still kept a protective arm around her. Her face was flushed, not just from the exertion or the fear, but with a sudden, deep embarrassment. She quickly smoothed her skirt, her fingers fumbling with the torn fabric, her gaze darting to the ground. Kestrel, for his part, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The image of her exposed leg, though accidental and momentary, had seared itself into his mind. He had promised to protect her honor, to shield her from impropriety. And in his desperate haste to save her from one danger, he had inadvertently, even if briefly, exposed her to another. The memory of her plea, "Don't lift my dress," echoed in his ears, a stark reminder of his vow. He looked away, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the horizon as if seeking a phantom enemy, and the air was still thick with dust, the sun a hazy orange disk. Clara was safe, physically unharmed, but a deeper injury had been inflicted, not upon her, but upon his own spirit. He had sworn to uphold his word, a sacred trust, and in that fleeting moment, he had failed. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, a heavy weight that settled deep in his chest. His honor, a cornerstone of his very being, felt chipped, tarnished. The world, which moments before had been a blur of danger and action, now seemed to slow, the silence between them heavy with unspoken regret. The cool evening air, once a terrifying harbinger of the approaching storm, now felt like a gentle balm against Clara's flushed skin. Her heart, a frantic drum a moment ago, began to settle into a steadier rhythm. She was safe. Kestrel's strong key arms, which had lifted her so decisively, lowered her to the ground with unexpected tenderness. Her skirt, having been lifted in the harrowing scramble, now draped properly around her, though a shiver of residual vulnerability still traced its path up her spine. She looked up, a silent, trembling "thank you" forming on her lips. Kestrel's face, usually a mask of controlled composure, was etched with something Clara hadn't expected to see. His dark eyes, typically sharp and assessing, held a flicker of deep, genuine concern, a raw worry that seemed to transcend the immediate danger they had just escaped. It wasn't the detached vigilance of a warrior protecting a charge. It was something warmer, more personal, a fleeting glimpse into a soul Clara was only just beginning to comprehend. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her. It wasn't disrespect she'd seen, but a quiet, almost anguished empathy. But the moment, as fragile as a butterfly's wing, was instantly shattered. The worry in Kestrel's eyes hardened, replaced by a sudden, intense cloud of shame. His gaze dropped from hers as if seared, and a deep flush, barely perceptible against his sun-kissed skin, crept up his neck. His jaw tightened, and the protective tension in his shoulders seemed to morph into a rigid self-condemnation. He had lifted her, exposed her, however briefly, to the elements and to his own view. In that desperate act of rescue, he had, in his own rigid code, sacrificed his honor. The unyielding principles that governed his life, the invisible threads of his heritage, had been irrevocably tangled. He took an abrupt step back, then another, the movement jerky and almost violent in its conviction. The intimacy of their shared peril, the unspoken understanding that had bloomed between them for a precious instant, evaporated like morning mist under a harsh sun. Clara reached out instinctively, a small, confused sound escaping her, but Kestrel flinched as if burned. His expression was a silent scream of internal conflict, a battle raging between duty and transgression. "Kestrel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of the dry grasses. He didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on a point beyond her, his profile a stark silhouette against the deepening twilight. The air around him crackled with a palpable tension, a silent lament for a code he believed he had broken. He had saved her, yes, but the cost, in his own eyes, was immeasurable. The weight of that glimpse, the unintended intimacy, pressed down upon him, heavy and unyielding. With a final, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he turned fully away, his broad back a barrier, his silence a chasm between them. The forest, once a refuge, now felt vast and empty. The sun, a blazing ember in the west, bled orange and purple across the boundless plains. Kestrel, a stark silhouette against the dwindling light, rode several paces ahead of Clara. His sturdy pinto moved with unhurried grace, its hooves stirring faint dust clouds that shimmered like gold motes in the twilight. Since leaving the canyon, he'd uttered barely a handful of words, his customary composure replaced by a rigid quietude, heavier than any approaching storm. Clara watched him, her own mare's rhythmic gait a gentle counterpoint to the turmoil in her thoughts. His shoulders, usually broad and relaxed, seemed to bear an invisible weight, subtly hunched. The set of his jaw was firm, almost grim, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if seeking a lost solace beyond himself. She knew with an empathetic certainty that settled deep in her bones that he was consumed by the day's events, particularly by his perceived failure. The memory of the ambush, the desperate struggle, and then the unspeakable intimacy of his actions to save her, replayed in her mind like a flickering lantern slide. He believed his honor violated, his principles betrayed by touching her, by lifting her dress. A pang of tenderness, mixed with fierce protectiveness, bloomed in her chest. How could she make him see he'd done nothing wrong, that in fact he had done everything right? The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Overhead, a lone hawk circled, its mournful cry echoing Kestrel's internal struggle. Clara longed to bridge the distance to offer comfort, but hesitated. His silence was a towering, unyielding wall, built of deeply ingrained duty and a rigid code. Mere platitudes felt insufficient, almost disrespectful to the depth of his conviction. She considered her approach. Should she be direct, asserting the honor and necessity of his actions? Or a more subtle path, weaving reassurance into casual conversation, hoping to soften the edges of his self-reproach? The thought of his likely quiet dismissal deterred her. He was not a man swayed easily by simple pronouncements. His honor was his very essence. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a lingering twilight that softened the landscape's harsh lines. Stars began to prick the deepening indigo, tiny pinpricks in the vast darkness. Kestrel remained ahead, a silent, solitary figure, a distant companion lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. Clara knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was resolute. She would find a way to reach him, to mend the fractured belief he held about himself, for his burden was, in a way, hers too. He had protected her, and now it was her turn to shield him from the shadows of his own honor. The rhythmic thud of hooves was a steady counterpoint to Clara's racing pulse. She spurred her mare, a sturdy bay with a surprisingly swift gait, until she drew abreast of Kestrel. He rode with his usual rigid posture, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but Clara noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles were white where they gripped the reins. The wind, still carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, whipped strands of hair across her face, but she ignored it, focusing solely on the man beside her. "Kestrel," she said, her voice soft, designed to cut through the wind without sounding shrill. She kept her tone even, hoping to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. He didn't immediately turn, but a subtle shift in his weight indicated he'd heard her. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast long shadows before them, stretching and contracting with each stride of their horses. The landscape around them was a blur of sagebrush and scattered juniper, punctuated by the occasional outcropping of rust-colored rock. "You saved me," Clara continued, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before she looked away, feeling a blush creep up her neck despite her resolve. "Back there, in the ravine, you truly did." Kestrel finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in them, surprise perhaps, or a deep-seated weariness. He didn't speak, merely listened, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the clip-clop of hooves and the sigh of the wind. "Those men, they would have hurt me," she explained, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You stopped them. You protected me. That is what a good man does." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "You acted with honor, Kestrel. True honor." He flinched almost imperceptibly at the word honor, and Clara saw the internal struggle etched on his face. The rigid lines of his jaw tightened further. He was wrestling with something she couldn't fully comprehend, but could sense was deeply personal and painful. "My people have a saying," Clara offered, choosing her words carefully, "that true honor isn't just about following rules or expectations. It's about doing what is right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." She met his gaze directly now, her own eyes unwavering. "You protected me from harm, Kestrel. You risked yourself. That is the highest form of honor." He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting from her face to the distant mountains, then back again. The harsh lines around his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. He seemed to be replaying the events in his mind, sifting through her words, weighing them against his own deeply ingrained principles. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, just a fraction. "You are a good man, Kestrel," Clara reiterated, her voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "And I thank you." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He still didn't speak, but the rigid set of his shoulders relaxed further. The deep furrow in his brow, which had seemed a permanent fixture, began to smooth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time since their harrowing escape, Clara saw a glimmer of understanding, a faint easing of the burden he carried. The silence that followed was no longer strained, but reflective, filled with the quiet understanding that had passed between them. Kestrel turned his gaze to Clara, the setting sun painting the dust motes dancing around them in hues of fiery orange. He saw not just the woman who had pleaded with him, but the fear in her eyes, the quiet strength that had allowed her to endure, and the genuine gratitude that now softened her features. Her words, spoken with a trembling earnestness, echoed in his mind. True honor, Kestrel, is in kindness, in protection, even when it means sacrificing something else. The rigid tenets of his warrior code, etched into his spirit since boyhood, wavered under the weight of her simple truth. He had always believed honor was an unyielding path, a strict adherence to rules, a shield against weakness. Yet what weakness was there in shielding another from suffering? What dishonor in offering solace when presented with distress? The memory of her plea, the vulnerability in her voice, resonated deeper than any tribal dictate. He had, in that moment, chosen to protect, to offer a moment of dignity in a situation that threatened to strip her of it entirely. A flicker of warmth, unfamiliar and unsettling, stirred within his chest. He realized that sometimes helping someone, truly seeing their need and responding to it, was more important than a strict rule, more powerful than any ancient law. His actions, born of a swift, almost instinctual decision, had redefined his understanding of honor, broadening its narrow confines to encompass a compassion he hadn't known he possessed. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant cry of a coyote and the gentle rustle of the evening breeze through the dry grass. Clara, though still a little flushed, met his gaze with a newfound serenity. She saw the change in him, a subtle softening around his stern eyes, a deeper understanding that seemed to settle over him like the dusk. He wasn't just a stoic warrior anymore. He was a man capable of profound empathy, a hero not just in deeds of strength, but in acts of quiet grace. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of deep violet and rose, Kestrel turned and began to walk. Clara, after a moment's hesitation, followed, her steps lighter, more confident. The air between them, once charged with unspoken tension and the chasm of their different worlds, now hummed with a quiet understanding. They continued their journey, not as two strangers bound by circumstance, but as true friends, forged in the crucible of a shared, difficult moment. He had learned that kindness was a strength, and she, that true heroism, often wore the guise of quiet compassion. The road ahead was long, fraught with unknowns, but for the first time, Clara felt a true sense of safety, a profound respect for the man walking beside her. He was, in her eyes, a true hero, and their intertwined paths had just begun.